Good morning, everyone. I am Rafea Arif. I'm a counselor here at the Norwegian mission with the UN. Last fall, I was, while we were still in Security Council, I was leading the work Norway was chair of the Security Council's working group for children armed conflict, and I was leading that work. So very grateful to be here, and thank you to UNIDIR and MEAC for convening us and for creating this lovely space to be able to have this conversation, and this session in particular. Both as previous chair for the working group and as Norway, the topic of children recruited and used by armed forces and groups is high on our agenda, alongside protection of children more broadly. There's a range of reasons why children become associated with armed forces and groups. Factors that contribute to their vulnerability to recruitment include economic, social, familial, and community factors, as well as conflict dynamics. States must take steps to address those drivers in a preventive manner, enhance protective factors. Not limited to, but building on existing community-based approaches and protective elements and involving children and families themselves, and building on existing strengths. As we know, environmental changes place severe pressure on individuals and societies. Vulnerable segments of the population, especially children, are likely to be first affected. Research shows that changes in climate patterns increase both the number of children willing to work as soldiers and armed groups' demands for them. As such, it is important that we address these issues head-on, and I am very much looking forward to this discussion today, and thank you so much for the panelists. So looking forward to listening to you, and I will just give the floor to Dr. Hoinathy. Please, go ahead.
I will be standing.
Okay.
So, good morning. I first have to apologize for those that have been with us since yesterday, because I'll be repeating most of what have been said yesterday. But I hope that this will pave the way for the discussion later on. So I will be very briefly talking about methodology, but not that much, because Shoban have been talking about. And then I will go deep in the findings of the research, meaning the motivations for people joining armed group in the Lake Chad Basin. And then I will finish with some recommendations. So we don't have the good one. Huh?
I think this is it.
Really? No. It's here. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
No worries.
So about the methodology is a multi-site research conducted in the 4 countries and the 8 regions directly impacted by Boko Haram. And we targeted people that have been joining the different armed groups, but also those that have been, in a way, resilient, I mean, living in the communities. Let us go directly to the factors that drive people to Boko Haram and other armed group. And it's a mix of many, actually, factors. And one of the main findings is that there is no standalone factor that drives someone to an armed group. It's most of the time a combination of many factors at the same time. And it's also a kind of process and a dynamic that end up driving people to those groups. And among the reasons, we have coercion. We have economic factors, but we have also the particular situation of the Lake Chad Basin regarding climate change. We also have familial and social networks, relationships, and then ideological motivations that in such a context is also very, very present. Regarding the first factor, coercion, we come to know that most of the people we have been talking with in the Lake Chad Basin actually have been coerced to join Boko Haram. But we also remain very conscious on the fact that it's maybe also because of the very nature of the sample that have been targeted by this or accessed by this research. Most of the people we have been talking to are people that are actually through reintegration processes or within centers like Meri in Cameroon, like Gudumaria or getting out of Gudumaria, or like centers like the Operation Safe Corridor Center, meaning that there are people that have been judged of low risk profile, meaning most of them have been victims of Boko Haram than people that joined Boko Haram willingly. We also noted that regarding Kuwait's recruitment within Boko Haram, the level of women and girls that have been obliged to join Boko Haram is actually higher than men or boys that have been obliged to join Boko Haram. There is also the economic situation in the Lake Chad Basin. It should be recalled that that region, even before the conflict, is situated on the merge of the 4 states. And in terms of economic investment or social services, they are less furnished than all the other places in the 4 countries, meaning that the economic situation in that zone is already very dire. And we see that most of the people that join Boko Haram actually, for a reason or another, are people that are actually experiencing dire economic conditions. And we observe that Boko Haram have also been, in a way, very skillful in turning those dire economic situations in recruitment narratives, targeting young people, luring them with promises of better economic prospects or social positions change, so to take them in Boko Haram. It's also important to note that this very situation actually is what strategies like the stabilization strategy for the Lake Chad Basin is trying to change. Regarding climate change, and those that were there yesterday, there was a debate about, the nature of climate change and how this is really affecting communities in that zone. It's something that, it's very common that there was this argument about the Lake Chad sinking. But when doing a research that should be based on evidence, it's about learning how people in that very zone experience themselves climate change on a daily basis. And when talking with farmers, with herders, and with the fishers, it's much about things that like temperature. Because in the dry season, you can, just by traveling there, see how many cattle is dying just out of heat. You can also see how actually people are fighting and thriving to access cultivable land because sometimes it's flooding or sometimes there is no rain at all. So these are the realities that in that zone qualify climate change. And because of those kind of changes, we then try to see with people if there is a link between that situation and the fact for them joining or not joining an armed group. And then we see that when talking with community members, but also when talking with people that have been joining groups like Boko Haram, most of the time, all of them, they know at least someone that because of climate change and livelihood challenges related to that situation end up joining Boko Haram. And this is only a matter of survival because they have to find a way out of the hardship they are experiencing because of climate change. And as you could see for this statement, this is the story of a man that actually is suffering because of access due to climate change. But most of the time, it's about people that because of the drought or because of floodings are actually losing all the crops they have been producing. So they have to find a way out of this situation. Let us now turn to the last factor. The last factor is here more social. It's about families and communities. And we turn out to know that when families are tight and when those families are resilient to Boko Haram, this is also a kind of barrier for people against those kind of groups or also against all kind of other armed groups. But in the situation where those families are not resilient to Boko Haram, then the family became a big driver to Boko Haram for all the other members. And friendship or peer networks also function the same way. It's the same way also for larger communities. When they are strong enough and resilient, then it means they can protect people from joining different armed groups. I will end up now with ideological motivations. I have 2 minutes, I think. So ideological motivations also something we should discussed with attention because it's very common, people saying that joining groups like Boko Haram, it's mostly a matter of ideology. But even though statistically we could not here isolate that factor in that study, based on experience by ISS in other states or based on the interviews conducted in Nigeria, we come to know that a conception of Islam have also been sold to some people so to take them in Boko Haram. But most of the time, as I already said, it's not a standalone factor. It also intertwined with all the other factors, joining the dynamic that in some way draft people to Boko Haram. So we finish with some recommendations and maybe a kind of way forward for the discussions later. It's about policing and programming. And we think that after research like that one, we definitely would advocate for evidence-based research before starting any kind of programming and policing. It's about knowing what people personally experience through those groups, out of those groups or within those groups, but also what they experience through all the reintegration programs. It meaning personal trajectories is very important when policing, but also the importance of families and communities in tailoring those programs. As I said, they can be a two-way factor, driving to or pulling out. So we should definitely also consider using them when policing for prevention against recidivism or for reintegration. And then the importance to anchor all the policies to the local realities and to all the dynamics that actually are in those different situations. In the Lake Chad Basin, I think climate change is something that we should absolutely consider when policing or programming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Remadji. I think that was a very insightful and good introduction to the research in Lake Chad Basin, and I think those recommendations as well is a good layout for a further discussion. Can I now please give the floor to Ms. Castro? Ángela, please go ahead.
It is on? Yeah, right. So thank you very much. It is a pleasure for me to be here to discuss about some factors that drive recruitment into armed groups in Colombia. First of all, I would like to talk about some methodological challenges for isolating recruitment factors. Then I'm going to discuss three topics. The first one is criminal and dissident groups on initial recruitment factors and some potential recruitment risk. Second one is the evidence about climate and environmental degradation related to livelihood loss. And the last one is a potential rebel justice as a driver for community from community perspective. Let's start with the methodological challenge, and is that this is a small sample. This is a sample of 50 participants of 375 participants of the differential assistance process. That is a new one in Colombia. It is just 2 years from the beginning of this process. However, it is a very important sample if we consider, as I said, that this process is still in early stages. Sorry. I don't know if I work. Yeah. So ex-combatant in differential assistance process noted that following factors influence their recruitment. So 30% of them refer economic difficulties as a main resource, and in connection with this, 50% reported they were interested in payment of the idea to be paid for. 26% of them reported to be forced by a group, especially in a range of ages between 18 and 24 years old. And the last one is the personal safety, considering that the 47% of the participants reported that they received threats before entering into the group. Yeah. So on the side of recruitment and potential re-recruitment, as I say, economic challenges are still a factor, especially if they think they receive direct offers of jobs or through their friendships. But at the end, there is a descent for these offers. This happened strongly during the pandemic when they offered them work in mining areas, for example, and when they arrived at the place, they were informed that they were already working for a group. That's it. As I said before, the security threats of them or their family, that these threats can be real or hypothetical, and because don't forget that they are defectors of these groups, so probably the groups are looking for them to avoid any intelligence work for the military forces. Finally, another factor is some of them still have the possibility to be contacted or vice versa, to be contacted by someone of the group. So for those who were contacted after they left, 18 of 50, which means the 72% of the participants, reported that they had been offered money. And one of the main groups that look for them to go back to the war are the partisans groups. Sorry, I didn't see. Well, sorry. This is the next one. Yeah, no. So on the climate and environmental changes and recruitment, several communities have experienced changes in weather events, such as flooding during their lifetime. However, there were differences between urban and rural areas in terms of the impact of this climate change. The rural areas have experienced greater impacts like the disproportionate recruitment effects and other humanitarian impacts. These changes imply economic and situation of vulnerabilities that lead people to join armed groups, and how community participants report with both types of changes, referring they know people joining armed group due to difficulties associated with these activities. Yeah. And here I would like to say that the MEAC survey is the first one in Colombia that shows that link between either climate change or human-induced environmental degradation and recruitment. And as you can see in this graphic, this is the relationship that the MEAC survey found. I'm going to do it like that. And this is because controlling the environmental service can be a tool for recruitment. Even when few norms were reported from dissident and criminal groups, some participants mentioned that they had permission to degrade the environment for purpose of mining or illegal coca crops, for instance. And also some of these groups seek to influence illegal economies, because there is several, not just those that I named, that they can permit. If they allow people to work in these economies, that's a way and a hook for recruitment people. The last one, I would like to talk about a possible relationship between rebel justice and recruitment. And this is an anecdotal evidence that we have suggesting that connection between sexual violence, indigenous women entering to armed groups. But this sexual violence is no like a strategic use by the groups. it is sexual violence inside the communities. So the option to get into groups could be a way to seek revenge through the action of these armed groups, probably because their communities or inside their communities, they don't have like the adequate tools or sufficient tools to find justice. However, there is a need for more investigation about this relationship to find more close whether it is happening in real or it is just like a isolate cases, and why this is happening, especially with indigenous communities. Finally, I would like to talk about some recommendations and next steps. The first one is that we should think about linked strategies to reduce illegal economies with efforts to prevent recruitment and build peace. Also, the idea that ensure peace, total peace strategies consider environmental governance can be important to prevent recruitment and even just like the initial recruitment. And the last one is the need to conduct further research to better understand the connection between sexual violence inside communities and recruitment into armed groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ángela. I think that's very helpful. And thank you also for highlighting both the environmental effects of illegal economic activity, but also indigenous communities. I think that's, again, for the discussion that's coming, I think that's a very important thing to bring forward. Now I'll give the floor to Mr. Jiyad. Sajad, please go ahead. I think if you just speak, it comes up.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So I am the Iraq researcher for the MEAC project and other work conducted by UN agencies, but I'm just one of a number of people in this room that I can see who've done Iraq-related work. So Melisande and Natalie and Erica and Jackie, my friend over there, and a couple of other people as well. So please also refer to some of their work and Mara as well, obviously. Broadly, the work that's being conducted in Iraq is in two categories. Either people who were or perceived to be part of insurgent groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on, or the people that are members of or affiliated with militias, armed groups usually formed in response to the first category. The focus of my research has been on the second category, which is the armed groups that have been formed since 2003 as a response to community challenges, other threats to security. My estimate is that since 2003, there have been over 500,000 people recruited into both of these categories. And if we want to look at people who are affiliated with family members, for example, part of these groups, then the number obviously increases, probably crosses the 3 million mark. So it is a big issue for Iraq, but unfortunately government policy does not really exist on preventing people from being recruited into armed groups. My research has looked at three sort of broad geographical areas. The first is in Sinjar. We're looking at northwest Iraq and specifically groups of Yazidis who were subjected to genocide when ISIS rolled into town from 2014 onwards. I looked at the Nainawa Plains, which is also in Mosul, near Mosul in Nainawa province, mostly Assyrian groups who were formed as a response to protecting their communities, again, because of ISIS's movement into those areas. And the third is in Basra province, where we've had what people commonly refer to as the militias formed, but they are now under the umbrella of the state. So the term PMF, the Popular Mobilization Force, is what is the official term for these groups. Their number is over 100,000 official members and combatants. They are part of the state security forces now. They're governed by law. They are no longer outlaws or just armed groups outside government framework. They are part of the state security. So dealing with them becomes a very particular challenge as well. Now, the purposes of this panel is we're looking at recruitment. in all three areas, there are various reasons why these groups recruited people. So for Sinjar, it was mainly community security. People were concerned about the genocide, and they formed to protect temples, communities, areas, homes. Later on, as security improved, people wanted to join armed groups because they had access to services, access to move freely, but also livelihood, income. There was no other game in town. I could only earn if I belonged to this group, and they would give me a salary. In the Nainawa Plains, it was security again, but also control of territory. People were very concerned about losing their ancient homelands, and they wanted to keep their communities active and in control, so they joined these armed groups to protect territory. In Basra, it was about income, again, earning a livelihood, but also the privileges that come with belonging to state security force, the freedom of movement, the access to multiple things that you wouldn't be able to access as a civilian. So the things that are in common between these is the legal cover of belonging to a group. You're no longer an outlaw. You're no longer a group that just exists outside, legal framework. You are recognized by the state. The second is that you have an access to income. In many of these conflict-affected areas, there is no other way to earn an income apart from belonging to these groups. And the third is that neither the state views it as illegal, nor does the community see it as something that's not acceptable. In fact, in all three of these areas, belonging to these armed groups is quite welcome. You're seen as defender of the community, defender of these people. So belonging to them is not a stigma or a taboo. In fact, it's the opposite. It's something that comes with honor. And so in this regard, when we look at DDR, it's a completely different context from the Lake Chad Basin or Colombia and other areas. These are people who are recognized by the states and who are welcomed by the communities. They are not insurgents or outsiders in this sense. Now, the rate of recruitment has obviously decreased massively. There's very few people that are being added to the numbers of these armed groups. But that's not because the government is countering their recruitment. It's just because they're saturated. The current number of the PMF is over 100,000 active members. And they are receiving salaries from the state. They just cannot add any more to their budget. But the PMF as an institution is continuing to increase its capacity. It now has $1 billion company that is going to operate in all sorts of businesses and take on contracting. And that is one of the ways in which they can add value to their members. If you belong to the PMF, you can also be involved in potentially business. You can also have non-combat roles. You can do other things when you're in the PMF. In addition to being recognized by the state, having access to finance, for example, being able to get a loan from the banks, receiving a plot of land, things like that you would not receive as just a civilian. So belonging to these groups is extremely important to their members. In my research, there was the vast majority of people did not want to leave those groups, and those that were forced to demobilize for various reasons, mostly injury, were eager to get back in if they could. So one person that we interviewed in Basra, he'd lost both his arms and legs, and his family had to care for him sort of 24 hours a day. And I asked him, was it worth it? Would you do it again? He said, I would. I would love to go back in. If they accept me right now, I would go back in despite my so when you talk to people like that, there is no sense of regret for the majority of them, and there is no wish to demobilize. There's no wish to leave those groups. There is actually stigma attached with demobilizing. They've lost status. They're no longer recognized by their family or their communities. They do not want to leave those groups. So the challenge of how to deal with people demobilizing, exiting these groups is markedly different from other countries. And I would also say that I'm going to be a little bit undiplomatic and contrarian. The root causes of recruitment have not been tackled. So from what I gather, the common theme from Lake Chad Basin, Colombia, other countries with Iraq is that the problem lies with government. Governments are not able to maintain a control of security. So in the Weberian term, they do not have a monopoly on the use of violence, which is why armed groups pop up. And there is poor governance, which again leads to the rise of armed groups. If we do not tackle the cause of this, we'll always be just treating the symptoms, how to get people to demobilize. That's after they've already been mobilized. We should really be looking at how to stop armed groups from being created from appearing, how to make sure that governments do a better job of offering security and also delivering governance, good governance, so that there is no need for these groups to crop up. In Iraq, unfortunately, we're way too far away from that. I don't know if the government is ever going to have an intentional policy to address this. I don't think so. So my best advice would be we need international sort of pressure and support to get the government to take these on as policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sajad. Thank you for walking us through the very complex and very different situation in Iraq. I think that's, thank you. Can I please now give the floor to Ms. Kiplagat? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good morning. And first, really appreciation to the organizers for inviting UNDP. I will be presenting one of the reports in our report series on prevention to violent extremism, focusing on the journey to extremism in Africa, pathways to recruitment and disengagement. Just to mention that we do have a complementary report that looks more at the groups. It looks at dynamics of violent extremism in Africa, and so this one focuses more on the individual level, and the other report, focuses more on the group level and that understanding. In 2017, UNDP released the first Journey to Extremism report, focusing on primary research. We had about 740 respondents, and we really wanted to explore who were these individuals and why did they join. This was really the primary reason. When we started doing the second report, the first thing we wanted to look at was the changing nature and continental picture of violent extremism in Africa. Also noting that when you look at the Global Terrorism Index, 4 out of the 10 most affected countries are in the African continent, and in particular the Sahel region. Secondly, between 2017 and when we started doing this report, there have been a lot more efforts to counter and prevent violent extremism. So we also wanted to explore how effective have these been. The individuals who join, are they aware of some of these programs, and so on. The second was really to see what has changed in terms of drivers, tipping points, and accelerators affecting vulnerability towards recruitment into violent extremism, tracking the variation in relation to the first report, looking at pathways from extremism, but I will not focus on these findings in this presentation. And lastly, to really strengthen the gender lens. So not only increasing the number of female respondents, but also having a gendered questionnaire. In terms of the approach, we applied political socialization theory to really uncover what we call the journey map of critical enabling factors, drivers, and triggers into recruitment and the disengagement process. In terms of the sample size, we had almost 2,200 respondents. Out of them, about 1,000 were members of violent extremist groups. Some still were at the time of the interview. And similar to the first report, we had a control group. So individuals who had somewhat similar profiles and were from similar areas. Just noting, when you look at also the 8 countries under focus, you will see geographically we focused on Lake Chad Basin region, overlap with Liptako Gourma, and then Somalia and Sudan. And particularly when we're looking at the Lake Chad Basin and Liptako Gourma, the interviews took place in particularly borderland areas, peripheral areas. In terms of the pathways and drivers to disengagement, we also looked at the turning point in terms of prompting individuals to leave such groups. But as I mentioned, I won't go much into that, but it will feature somewhat in terms of the recommendations, which is why I mention it. So this just gives you a bit of a breakdown in terms of the respondents, in terms of the voluntary, forced, and reference group. And what you will also notice in terms of the chart on the left-hand side is in terms of the age. And what we noticed that in terms of recruitment, it has really dropped. And looking at children from 10 to 17, there's been, quite an increase in terms of membership in these groups. In terms of the key findings, the main reason cited by voluntary recruits for joining was for employment. What was very interesting was that the majority of those who cited employment were not unemployed. So they were young men who were married, and I think this also says something in terms of social expectations and responsibilities, and this was the primary reason, for joining. As others have mentioned in terms of the ideological reasons, in the 2017 report, we found 40% cited ideological reasons, and in this report, we had 17%. But what is consistent across, both respondents from 2017 and the 2023 report was that those who cite ideological reasons always state they have little to no understanding or need someone to interpret the text. So I just wanted to highlight that. In terms of education, this was very important as a resilience factor, both religious education and secular education. And we found that there was a 17% decrease in terms of likelihood of joining if one had more education, and most of the voluntary recruits had less than 4 years. In terms of trust, this is very interesting because there was a significant difference in 2017 in terms of trust. So 73% at this time stated they had little to no trust in national government and security. And what we found now is that the levels of trust are low, both in the primary and the control group. So it's 50% to 58%, between the two. And this really shows an overall, one would say, fraying of the social contract. One of the interesting findings that got a lot of attention in 2017 was this concept of a tipping point. So we also explored it a bit further, and of those who said that they experienced a tipping point, 71% cited abuse of human rights, particularly heavy-handed government security action. So also noting that some of this action can be, counterproductive. The access to information was interesting because in terms of the primary group, they tended to be people who were quite isolated. And so even in terms of access to the internet, recruits that never use or lack access to the internet at the time of joining join more quickly than others. And just to share in terms of time period, it varied between 1 month to about 1 year in terms of joining. It has been mentioned, by other speakers in terms of the importance of familial connections, social connections. And, what we found was that male recruits were more likely to join with friends, also disengage with friends, while female recruits were more likely to join with family members and in particular husbands. In terms of also exiting the group, just to mention, is that we noted also a bit of a cascading effect. So again, really the importance of these peer-to-peer and familial connections. In terms of the policy implications, the first is something which we have emphasized from 2017 in terms of really the oversight of human rights compliance, rule of law, and accountability, which is really key. The social contract, has been highlighted. I think accountability came out quite strongly, yesterday. As it has been mentioned, a lot of these governance deficits create conditions conducive to the growth of violent extremism leading to terrorism. So looking at some of these governance deficits in terms of improving service delivery, quality and accountability. What we found, for example, in Mali, 83% stated that they joined a violent extremist group to get good access to justice. Embedding a conflict-sensitive approach, not highlighting particular populations or groups of people, really having proper analysis. Having these community-based approaches, noting that while they might be inspired by global ideas, really the drivers and grievances are very much local grievances which are used. Reinvigorating prevention of violent extremism efforts within peacebuilding and sustainable development policy frameworks, because what we note is that as a practice, it has been a little bit apart. And so, for example, if you're looking at concepts, for example, as infrastructures for peace, how to have a better, integration of violent extremism prevention within that, for example, with early warning, early response. And finally, really looking at cost-effective prevention and long-term development. When we looked at the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy between 2021 and 2022, we had 73% of funding going to counterterrorism, 24% these are commitments, going into addressing conditions conducive to violent extremism, and only 3% to human rights. What we found in the 8 countries under study is in terms of overseas development assistance, only 8% went to prevention and peace building. So this is really the main message in terms of both the prevention and the response, noting there are exits, what conditions are people returning to, and hence really the need for this informed development lens and approach to address violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nirina. Thank you for bringing us back a little bit more to the overarching look at this. Now, thank you to the panelists for all your inputs. I will now give the floor to our discussant, Ms. Koudjou. Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Really, thanks a lot to all the panelists for those excellent presentation and key recommendation that they have provided to us. And as a practitioner, I think that there are key recommendations that we need to bear in mind from all those various contexts. As the panelists have mentioned, one of the key aspects when it's come to the driver that push some individual to join the armed groups, it's really around the lack of access to livelihood that has been mentioned by various panelists. Even in the case of Iraq, I will say that that's also one of the key aspects, because people are joining because that's the membership belonging to an armed group provide them with access to a means to gain a livelihood and access to various services. In addition to that, they gain a status. So I think for us as practitioners, these are key elements that we need to factor in when we're developing any type of intervention beyond the label that we want to put on it. Regardless of the label that we put, we need to really factor in those key aspects. Also, the fact that climate change or environmental change also influence the decision of individual to look for alternative livelihood through joining an armed group. It's also an aspect that needs to be included in our programming planning. The other things are working closely with community members, particularly family members. How do we include in our programming intervention that also benefit to family members in order to ensure a sustainable reintegration of those individuals? It's also key. The other point that I also took on board, it's for sure in all contexts, lack of good governance, it's also a key aspect. And it's where maybe member state donors could also look into how the collaboration with various government need to be thought through, in particular in some hotspot location where those that are easily recruited based on those 2-3 key factors that were mentioned: livelihood, lack of security, security means for their community, lack of basic services, access to basic services are key aspect that we need to ensure that at the highest level is being discussed with the government that we are that some of us are supporting in reducing the threat posed by those armed groups. And also maybe one of the last point, ensuring that local reality are really factored in the programming that we're doing. It's key. As we like to say, no one size fits all. It's not because it works in Colombia that it will work in the Lake Chad Basin. However, there might be good practices that we could learn and try to adjust and adapt to those contexts. And I think the context of Iraq really also says a lot, that people, because they gain a status and have access to various, let's say, privileges by joining the armed groups, joining an armed group become the key objective for them. So how do we offer them alternative? How can they access the same type of privilege without the need of joining an armed group? Maybe this is something that for that particular case need to be thought through. And for us as practitioners, I really want us to really, no matter how we call it, PRR, SPR, DDR, DD-RRR, whatever label we want to put on it, how do we concretely prevent and sustain the support that we're providing to those ex-combatants? How do we prevent their recruitment? And once they disengage, how do we maintain them in the community? This is really key. And it's really where working closely with various intervention and showing complementarity about various intervention is very key, because no one can do it all. We need to really ensure complementarity of our intervention. So I'll stop here. Thanks a lot again to all the panelists, and thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to be part of this discussion. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I think that was a very good end of this panel, with being so concrete about what needs to happen going forward. So thank you so much to everyone. I will leave the floor to you.